Hello everyone and welcome to another video. One of the many skills you need when dealing with electronics is soldering, so today I've put together a short tutorial on how to solder wires together. There are a few things you'll need to gather before we begin. Number 1. A soldering iron. You can pick up a soldering iron from just about any electronics store, hardware store, or home improvement store for less than $10. I picked this 30-watt soldering iron up for about $4 at Harbor Freight. If you plan on soldering small electronics or thin wires, a 15-watt soldering iron will probably be your best choice. When soldering larger gauge wires, however, a 30-watt soldering iron should be chosen for best results. Number 2. Lead-free rosin core solder. This particular solder can be bought at Harbor Freight for about $3.50. Number 3. Heat shrink tubing. You will only need a small piece to cover the exposed metal surface after you've completed the solder. Number 4. A butane lighter. This is used to shrink the heat shrink tubing onto the wire. Number 5. A tool or sharp blade to strip the insulating jacket off of the wires you wish to solder. Number 6. Lead-free tinning flux. Even though the lead-free rosin core solder has a small amount of flux in it, soldering is much easier to perform with a small bit of flux put on the wire prior to soldering. The flux enables the solder to flow freely onto the copper. If there was no flux on the wires or on the solder would likely bead up and fall off of the wire rather than adhering to it. An optional item you can use to keep your soldering iron clean is a damp sponge. So let's begin. After you've gotten your soldering iron hot, you need to strip your wires with your stripping tool. In the case of this razor blade, simply place the wire on the blade and in a circular motion go around the entire circumference of the wire, being careful not to cut the copper wires on the inside. Once you've done this, you can then twist the outer jacket to remove it from the copper wire underneath. Note, you may have to go back and put some more cut on the insulation. Usually just twisting the jacket back and forth will free it from the copper wire, however. Once again, I'll show you one more time. This time, twist the wire over the razor blade. Just the jacket, very lightly. Do not push deep, otherwise you will cut the copper. And then twist the jacket back and forth to remove it from the copper underneath and pull the insulating jacket off, like so. Now that we have the two copper pieces exposed, before you solder you want to put the heat shrink tubing on the wire. Otherwise, once you get it done, and if it's a part of, say, a car or whatever, you'll have soldered the wire together with nowhere to put the heat shrink tubing on. So put the heat shrink tubing onto the wire before you solder the wire. Now that you've got that done, we need to twist the wires together. You want to get this twist as tight as you possibly can. In some cases it's going to be a little difficult because the wires themselves can't twist because maybe they're fixed installed or something like that. But just get the twist as tight as you can. So now that we have the wires twisted together, we're going to begin the process of soldering. Now I'm going to put a little bit of flux on the wires, as explained before. The flux helps the solder flow to the copper. And here is I'm going to put a little bit of flux on the soldering iron and then clean it off with the sponge. Alright, so now we're going to pull a little bit of rosin core solder out and begin soldering the wire. Place the soldering iron directly on the copper. Don't place it on the solder. Place the solder on the wire. You want the solder to adhere to the wire, so you heat the wire up so that the solder will adhere to the wire. Put a liberal amount of solder on the wire to where it's covering it entirely, and just if you start seeing a little bubble of solder develop at the bottom, you know you've got just right amount on there. Don't put any more on there. we have a full solder of the two wires together. I'm going to clean my iron off there. Alright, so now it's time to shrink the wire together. Put the heat shrink tubing on, excuse me, so that we can seal our connection up. Alright, so I'm going to place the heat shrink tubing over the wire, like so. I'm going to get my butane lighter, and then just keep it a couple inches away, about an inch or so away, so that you don't burn it, but that it shrinks onto the wire. Go over it a couple times, just make sure it is as shrunk as it's going to get, and get it in here, but don't catch it on fire, don't melt it. There's your soldered wire with heat shrink insulation. Thanks for watching. Like if you liked it, dislike if you didn't. Please subscribe.